In my last video, in which I discussed this trend of the Western powers sending exponentially increasing amounts of financial and military support to Ukraine, I mentioned the fact that the entire strategy that the West seems to have in weakening Russia is, on a geopolitical level, completely stupid. As a reminder, the short version of this argument is that the war in Ukraine isn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine, it is a war between two power blocs. And these power blocs are the rising bloc that is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the superpowers of the East, so to speak, and the collective West. And Russia is not the top dog among the Eastern superpowers. The real Cold War will be between the United States, backed by the rest of the collective West, and China, which will also be backed by its own allies in turn. And in light of this, I want to say that this strategic policy, this plan of action that Western leaders have openly described, that their aim is to use the war in Ukraine to weaken Russia, to expend lots and lots of resources, donating military and economic aid to Ukraine in order to bleed Russia dry, is ultimately a stupid plan. It is a stupid plan because it's not weakening the top dog, it is attacking the knight when you should be attacking the king. So that was the argument that I made in my last video. In this video, I would like to expand upon those thoughts and to discuss another reason of why this plan of trying to bog down Russia in Ukraine isn't even going to weaken the knight, it is going to make that knight stronger. And the simple reason for this is that countries are only weakened by wars when they lose those wars. They are usually not weakened by wars when they win. And I have explained a million times in all of my previous videos why Russia isn't losing and isn't going to lose the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is Russia's backyard. It is historically and culturally a part of Greater Russia. And even militarily, Ukraine is a part of Greater Russia, since a lot of the military infrastructure that Ukraine has was built during the Soviet Union by the government in Moscow. Therefore, the government in Moscow knows exactly where all of that infrastructure is, what its purpose is, and which parts of that infrastructure it needs to take out. But I digress. Putting all of this insane propaganda that this small, insanely corrupt country, which has for several years now been the poorest country in all of Europe, is suddenly beating one of the world's largest and most powerful militaries, putting all of that propaganda to one side, and looking at the situation on the ground with a little bit of objectivity, it becomes obvious that Ukraine is not winning this war. If it was, it wouldn't be throwing increasing masses of untrained and barely armed draftees at the Russian military. Draftees which, I might add, often surrender without even so much as a battle. The simple fact is that Russia hasn't even conducted one wave of conscription yet, whereas Ukraine is basically scraping the barrel when it comes to drafting everybody that they possibly can. And this policy of scraping the barrel doesn't just extend to manpower, it extends to equipment as well. So Russia isn't losing this war. And given how much of an existential war this is for Russia in the long term, given how critical this war is for Russia's geopolitical future and for its sovereignty from Western control and influence, Russia is not going to back down and it's not going to lose this war. So realistically speaking, sooner or later, Russia is going to win this war. And a country that wins wars doesn't become weakened by them. Now, of course, there is an exception to this, which is a Pyrrhic victory, but I would argue that even a Pyrrhic victory doesn't weaken a country in the way that some might think. After all, going back to the Second World War, the Soviet Union lost more than 10% of its population in a matter of 4 years, and the majority of this 10% of the total population were young, able-bodied men. But nonetheless, The Soviet military towards the end of the Second World War was incomparably stronger and more capable than the Soviet military before the war. Of course, the demographic effects of the Second World War would then weaken Russia in the coming decades and likely the next centuries as well, but that is the long term. In the short term, even a Pyrrhic victory doesn't weaken a country. A victory makes a country stronger. And a Russian victory in Ukraine isn't going to be a Pyrrhic victory. It's not going to be a victory that requires the sacrifice of more than 10% of modern Russia's population, or even 1% of Russia's population. So, realistically speaking, the consequences of this war will be that the Russian military will have received a trial by fire. And that trial by fire will have, and to some extent already has, exposed many of the real flaws that exist within the Russian military. And I don't want to discuss the exact nature of these flaws yet, not while there is a war that is going on, because I fully understand that this information, even though it's not secret, even though it's public information, bringing unnecessary attention to it can have real consequences. Suffice it to say that many of these actual real flaws that have been exposed in the war up until now, up until this point, have pretty much nothing in common with the fairy tales that Western mainstream media is spinning. And to be fair, pretty much every war reveals the weaknesses of both sides in one way or another. Wars provide more experience and provide a far better opportunity to strengthen and perfect a country's armed forces than any military exercises possibly can. And it is a perfectly common thing to see a lot of these imperfections be exposed during this real trial by fire, and for them to then be fixed after the war. After all, this is pretty much what happens any time that a country fights and the military of that country doesn't cease to exist afterwards. If that military doesn't cease to exist, then all attempts will be made to improve upon the imperfections that have been revealed, to modernize it, and to make it more capable for the next war. This is what happened to the United States in Korea and later in Vietnam, even though the United States was politically and militarily defeated in Vietnam. This is what happened to the Russian military in Chechnya and after Syria. And it's also what happened to the militaries of countless other countries throughout history. But on top of these doctrinal and organizational imperfections, which I am 100% confident that the Russian military is already starting to fix and will have undoubtedly fixed shortly after the war ends, there is also the fact that a large number of Russian soldiers and the Russian general staff will have received priceless combat experience. And once again, real combat experience is something that military simulations, military exercises can't really make up for. As things are looking now, by the end of this war, the Russian military will have been the only major world military to have fought a major war anywhere on the planet within the last 50 years. Because at the end of the day, even the Gulf War that the United States fought against Iraq in 1991 was of nothing like the same scale and was fought against a vastly inferior opponent to what Ukraine is. So to put it in other words, Pyrrhic victories aren't what truly makes a military stronger, but neither are these minor victories that are won basically without effort. It's these mid-sized wars, it's these wars that are large, that are truly grueling, but that don't result in millions and millions of deaths, that ultimately make the country which wins that war, as well as its military, stronger. They are the ones that provide the real trial by fire. They are the ones that bestow tons and tons of experience on everybody who participates in these wars, without actually having a large part of the armed forces be killed or otherwise incapacitated. But on top of all of this, Russia will be militarily and geopolitically stronger after this war because Russia is going to have access to Ukraine. That is to say, to Ukraine's population, of which a large part is pro-Russian, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine, to Ukraine's natural resources, to Ukraine's territory, which can then be used to create military bases on top of the few existing military bases that are in serviceable condition, which exist in Ukraine right now. Most importantly, naval bases in Nikolaev will come under the control of the Russian military, and that will further strengthen Russia's naval presence in the Black Sea. Russia will undoubtedly create a direct land bridge to Transnistria, thereby reuniting with a small breakaway splinter of the Russian world. And on top of all of this, military factories and industries that exist in Ukraine, such as tank factories in Kharkov, companies like Motor Sich and many others, which, contrary to some narratives, do produce some very important modern equipment, all of them will be integrated into the Russian military-industrial complex. And people who have been watching my previous videos know how highly I think of the military-industrial complex and its importance in sustaining the military capabilities of a country. So at the end of the day, no matter how one looks at it, Russia is going to gain a lot more from this war than it is going to lose. It is going to become geopolitically and militarily stronger than it was before. And all of this is inevitable. It is inevitable because sooner or later, Ukraine is going to completely lose this war. It is going to have to unconditionally surrender to Russia. Once again, the only thing that can possibly avert this course of events is a direct, full-scale NATO military intervention, and that is going to lead us to a nuclear war, which, for the record, I do not believe is going to happen, simply because all of these politicians in the European Union and even in the United States know perfectly well that in that case, there won't be anything left of them personally. So the only two possible chains of events are a full-scale nuclear war between NATO and Russia, which is always a big danger and should not be underestimated, but thankfully can be ruled out with a little bit of confidence, leaving the only other chain of events being a complete military defeat and destruction of Ukraine. I don't exclude the possibility that perhaps there might be a NATO peacekeeping intervention into some tiny sliver of Western Ukraine, which will then be called the quote-unquote real Ukraine, but de facto it won't be anything like the Ukraine that we have today. And at that point, for all practical intents and purposes, Ukraine as a country would have ceased to exist, and the lion's share of its territory, population, and natural resources will have, in one form or another, perhaps not as the result of direct annexation, but by installing something like a puppet government, come under the control of Russia. And on top of that, you will have a battle-hardened Russian military, which will and is already moving to rapidly fix the imperfections that have been revealed during the course of this war. That is by far the most likely outcome. Doesn't sound like something that is going to weaken Russia politically or militarily to me. So, in a nutshell, the current Western strategy is to completely ignore the enemy king, target the knight instead, try your absolute darnest to weaken the knight by sacrificing all sorts of political and economic resources in aiding your pawn, that is, Ukraine. And at the end of the day, for all of this, you still don't even weaken the enemy knight, you make him stronger. An absolutely horrible, abysmal, brain-dead excuse for a strategy if there ever was one. And with those final words, I am going to wrap up this topic. I thank you for watching this video, and I encourage you, if you haven't already, please be sure to check out my other channels on Telegram and on Rumble. Telegram and Rumble are both amazing platforms that have no political censorship, and especially Telegram is unique in that it allows me to write small posts giving various updates without having to make entire videos. There are also lots of other channels on Telegram that have a lot more content than my channel, which give regular live updates to the military situation that is on the ground in Ukraine. So I strongly encourage you to check out these channels. If you are watching this video on YouTube, the links to my Rumble and Telegram channels will be in the video description, whereas if you are watching this video on Rumble, then the links will be to my YouTube and Telegram channel respectively. Also, if you are watching this video on YouTube, please be sure to hit that like button, since it helps the algorithm make this video more popular by recommending it to more people. With all of that said, I thank you for watching this video once again, and I wish you all a wonderful day.